Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. My guest is George A. Bray III, French and Indian War historian, lecturer, and reenactor who served on the New York State French and Indian War 250th Anniversary Commemoration Commission. Welcome, George.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
It's great to have you back. Last year you spoke on Colonel Monroe. This year you're going to speak about Lord Howe, with a very storied but short career. Would you give us a bit of background on Lord Howe prior to his arrival in North America?
Yeah, sure. He was George Augustus Viscount Howe was the eldest son of Emmanuel Scrope, peer of Ireland, and upon his father's death, he acquired his title as Viscount. He was initially commissioned as an ensign, the lowest rank in the British Army, in the 1st Foot Guards in the year 1745, and would later become a lieutenant colonel in 1749. And prior to arriving in North America, he was colonel commandant of a battalion of the 60th Regiment of Foot, or Royal Americans. And he would then later receive 2 more promotions before his untimely death, which we'll be speaking about. So he came from a privileged background, and he was related to the royal family. He had 2 brothers, Richard and William, who would also gain fame more in the Rebel War, although they participated in the French and Indian War as well. So the Howe family was very prominent during the 18th century.
Now, when did Lord Howe first come to North America, and what was his mission at that time?
Okay, he would arrive in North America in 1757. Initially, he would come over from Ireland with part of the British Army that was destined for the campaign against Louisburg, commanded by Major General John Campbell, Lord Loudon. And he arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia on June 30th, but soon after he left, because he arrived in Boston on August 2nd, and then he would arrive at Fort Edward by August 6th. And this was, of course, during the siege of Fort William Henry when he arrived there. His mission, possibly initially, would have been to participate in the Louisburg campaign, but I haven't been able to find that out with absolute certainty. But apparently his mission, if it was that, got changed to join up with the forces in the Lake George corridor. So he's with Major General Daniel Webb during this time, of course, at Fort Edward under the time of the siege. And Webb and Engineer Colonel James Montresor go with Howe out to view the environs of Fort Edward, with the intent of improving the fortifications there and to decide how much artillery would be needed to defend those positions. By December, he would also be in command of the 55th Regiment of Foot.
So Howe was too late for the siege of Fort William Henry, or was he held at Fort Edward while he was there?
He remained at Fort Edward. So he's only a colonel at this time because he still commanded initially the 1 battalion of the 60th Regiment of Royal Americans. So he would have been subordinate to Webb, and Webb, of course, wouldn't even let Israel Putnam or anybody else go up to Fort William Henry. So yeah, he would have been kept at Fort Edward.
Now, by all accounts, I mean, and I've read a lot about Lord Howe to the point where he's probably like my favorite British officer during the French and Indian War. He was very popular with the troops and thought to be a very capable military leader. Why is that, George? I mean, was it competence, charisma? What did he have that everyone responded to?
Well, those things, but he was an officer unlike most. He was able to get the British regulars and the Anglo-American provincial soldiers to work together for the campaign. The year before, the provincials had refused to work with the regulars in the theater. He was able to get them to come together and work for this campaign of Abercromby's. So in addition to that, he was instrumental in making adaptations to the Army that allowed them to operate in the woods in North America better than they had during the first years of the war. He had them cut their clothing down. Their muskets were blackened to prevent the glinting in the sun. And he ordered his officers not to carry anything other than what was necessary for the campaign against Fort Ticonderoga. And not only did he make these rules, but he followed them and others as well. And he wore a uniform that was an extra ammunition coat or enlisted soldier's coat. So he didn't even dress up in officer's finery. Major General James Wolfe, who was another well-beloved officer and who would become famous and die in the King's service at Quebec in 1759, wrote that he was the spirit of that army and the very best officer in the King's service. New York provincial colonel wrote that after the battle that Ticonderoga, our loss was trifling in numbers, but great in the person of Lord Howe, who was the soul of the army. And William Pitt described him as a character of ancient times, a complete model of military virtue. So consequently, he was well respected and considered to be an excellent officer and asset to the British arms.
Now, for 1758 and the debacle at what's now Ticonderoga and the British failure to take it, Fort Carillon, Abercromby is painted as the bad guy. Basically, he failed. His leadership was horrid. How did Lord Howe get along with Abercromby, under whom he served?
Well, I have to assume fairly well. I don't know of any documentation that basically gets into the relationship in any detail. As a matter of fact, I'm only aware of 2 letters Howe wrote, and they don't pertain to that at all. They were just personal notes, but in that particular case, I'm not able to elaborate.
Okay, well, it seems as though he had much engagement with Rogers and Stark and Rogers Rangers. Can you elaborate a bit on how Lord Howe saw them and related to them? Lord
Howe was, of course, second in command to Abercrombie, so assuming he knew him and worked with him well, as far as I can tell. But beyond that, Abercrombie, after his death, would write, he was a very deservedly universal beloved and was respected throughout the whole army. It is easy to conceive the grief and consternation his untimely fall occasioned. For my part, I cannot help owing that I felt it most heavily and lament him as sincerely. So that might be as close as I can come to, how he felt about him. Robert Rogers had the opportunity to take him out on a scout in 1757 to learn his methods of warfare, and Howe expressed satisfaction with the experience. Rogers' cadet company would be formed about the same time, and Howe's adaptations to the Army the following year were in part based on his observation of the Rangers. And then Rogers also met with Howe again in April of 58, and he wrote in his journal that he had a most agreeable interview and a long conversation concerning the methods of distressing the enemy and prosecuting the war with vigor the ensuing campaign, and further stated that he had parted with Howe having the strongest assurances of his friendship and influence upon my behalf to wait upon Colonel Grant, commanding officer at Fort Edward, to assist him in conducting the Rangers and scouting parties in such a manner as might best serve the common cause, having a letter from Howe to him. Stark was a captain in Rogers Rangers and is said to also have been a friend of his, and the night before Howe's death, they are said to have met together in Howe's tent, sitting on a bearskin where they supped and discussed a plan of attack. Howe gave orders for the Rangers to carry the bridge over the river between the lake and Ticonderoga, which would have been the bridge over the River Lachute. Captain Philip Schuyler, he was a member of Colonel John Bradstreet's battalion and was also a friend, as were members of Schuyler's family. And tradition states that he accompanied Howe's body back to Albany, where it is believed to be buried, though others contend it was buried in Ticonderoga, which I will explain in more detail during the lecture. And finally, one other personality that may be well known was he knew Captain Israel Putnam, and Putnam was supposedly beside him or near him prior to his death and tried to prevent him from advancing to the front, endangering himself, but of course that failed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the summary, George. Now, Lord Howe's story ends at the Battle of Carillon in 1758, and we're going to discuss that in part 2 of our discussion with George Bray in the next edition of Lake George Battlefield Moments. We thank George for being our guest today, and reminder, he'll be speaking on the life of Lord Howe on Saturday, April the 12th, 11 a.m., at the Holiday Inn Lake George. Admission is free, but we do ask you to reserve your seats by emailing us at info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.